This lesson is going to be focusing on the respiratory system, and we're going to be looking at how we breathe. These are the learning objectives for this lesson. Please ensure that at the end of this lesson you are able to confidently achieve all of these objectives. These are the key terms that you need to know for this lesson. There are some tricky words that you'll have to try and attempt to spell correctly. For example, pharynx and larynx. Have a practice at that. It's important in biology that you are able to spell these words. For your reference, you should have read textbook page 86 to 88, and you should be completing your notes on pages 4 to 7 of your class booklet. Okay, we're going to start off by looking at the anatomy of the respiratory system. So we're going to start up here. So after air enters the nose and the mouth, we are in this space at the back of the nose called the nasal cavity. As air passes through the nasal cavity, we hit the back of the throat, and this is called the pharynx. From the pharynx, we pass through this flap of tissue, and this ensures that food and air go down the correct tube, and that is called the epiglottis. Now, when we swallow food, the epiglottis covers the windpipe or the trachea, and when we are breathing normally, it covers the esophagus or the food tube. Once we pass the epiglottis, we then pass through this structure here where our vocal cords are located, and this is called the larynx. After we pass over the larynx, we then get down this tube here, and this is the trachea. Now the trachea you can actually feel at the front of your throat, and you can feel these rings of cartilage as well. After the trachea, we can see that it splits into two larger tubes that feed each lung, and these are called the bronchi. Singular is bronchus, so each tube, if we're talking about them together, we refer to them as bronchi. As you can see, the bronchi split off into smaller and smaller tubes until eventually we get these tiny, looks like bunches of grapes, these air sacs. So the bronchi split off into smaller bronchioles, and that ends in air sacs known as the alveoli. Now, of course, all of these structures are maintained within each lung. Now, if we go and look at the other structures associated with the respiratory system, we have the ribs on the outside, and this, of course, is a hard bony structure that protects the lungs. And in between the ribs, we have intercostal muscles. Now, these muscles play a very important role in helping to regulate our breathing. Another muscle that helps to regulate our breathing is the diaphragm, which is this large dome-shaped sheet of muscle directly underneath our lungs. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at each of those structures in turn to make sure that you understand the significance. So first of all, as I've mentioned, air enters the nose and the mouth, and it reaches the nasal cavity. Now, within the nasal cavity, it's lined by epithelial cells which secrete mucus. Okay, so that mucus helps to trap any dirt, dust and bacteria that you breathe in. It's warm and sticky, which also helps to dehumidify that air that as we breathe it in, and the hairs will help to filter any of that potential bacterium causing chemicals. So that's the nasal cavity. The pharynx is this region here. So it's not just one thing that you can put your finger on, it's an entire region. So that's why I've highlighted it here. Okay, so this is a region of the nasal cavity, and it sits directly above the trachea, and this is where air enters. So once that air has been warmed up and it's been filtered, it starts to pass down the pharynx. This structure here, the epiglottis, this is a piece of tissue primarily made of elastic cartilage, and this will cover the esophagus, which I'm pointing to here, so that when we breathe in air, it's just flowing mostly down that trachea. And then finally we reach over the larynx. Again, as I've said, this is where your voice box is and your vocal cords are. This structure, as I showed you in the previous slide, is made chiefly of cartilage, and air passes over that structure to vibrate those vocal cords as air passes into the lungs. So what you can see in this animation here is this is a human vocal cords. This is someone saying the letter E, and as they do that you can see that the muscles contract and it pulls those vocal cords apart, and those white tendinous cords there, they vibrate, and what that does is that creates sound, and this is actually how we are able to speak and produce sound. So it's all to do with air vibrating these vocal cords and the shape of those cords changing. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the trachea. Now, as I've said, the trachea is located at the front of the throat, and you can feel it here, and you can also feel these hard cartilaginous structures which are evident here on this diagram. We commonly call the trachea the windpipe, but as this is human biology, you should stick to the human biological term. The function of the windpipe is to facilitate the transfer of oxygen-rich air into the lungs and to facilitate the transfer of carbon dioxide-rich air out. As I've mentioned, we have rings of cartilage, and they're actually C-shaped. They don't form a complete ring the whole way around, and you can see that at the back of the trachea here. The function of these cartilaginous rings is to keep the trachea open at all times. So it doesn't matter if you're pointing your head down, tying your shoelaces, or looking up or side to side. These cartilaginous rings will ensure that the airways are nice and open all the time. Additionally, the bronchi, that's the two tubes that feed each lung, or bronchus if you're talking singularly, they also have rings of cartilage, and the trachea splits from that. Now, the lining of the trachea itself is made up of epithelial tissue. And here I've got a histological picture of that, so you can see that it's epithelium because all these cells are tightly packed together. Here's a cartoon picture of it down here. Now, these epithelium, what's really important about the ones in the trachea is they have cilia. So these are ciliated epithelium. And what we can see here is a goblet cell, and there's a cartoon picture of it there. Now, these goblet cells produce mucus that lines the top of the ciliated epithelium. And the reason for that is because when you breathe in air, and let's say you're living in a big city, there's going to be a lot of smog and congestion, and that means you're going to be breathing in a lot of dirt and dust, and you don't want that getting into your lungs. So the important thing about this is that the mucus will trap that dirt and dust, and the cilia will beat rhythmically upwards towards the mouth, and will try and make sure that trapped dirt and dust on that mucus moves away from the lungs, and you can swallow it, and then that will go into your stomach, and you will destroy any potential bacteria. Okay, so once we've gone down the trachea, we then split into the bronchi. Now, the first bronchi that we come across are called the primary bronchi. The secondary ones are the ones that split off from the primary ones, and then we have tertiary ones that split off from the secondary. All of these still have those rings of cartilage, the C-shaped cartilage, to keep the airways open. However, the smaller branches, you can see here, there's less cartilage on them, and there's more elastin tissue. So that's a type of tissue that and smooth muscle that keeps those airways open. The bronchioles are the smallest branches of the bronchi. So the tertiary bronchi divide into bronchioles. Okay, and you can see that there, and these are called terminal bronchioles, and that's because the word terminal means ending, remember. So these, you don't have any more bronchioles after this. Now, bronchioles do not have any cartilage on them at all. They only have smooth muscle and elastin fibers, and the reason for this is because they have this elastic and contraction relaxation property, which allows them to control the airflow going into the lungs and therefore the expansion of the lungs. Again, as a safety mechanism, the terminal bronchioles also contain cilia and mucus, and this tries to further protect the lungs from getting any dirt and bacteria and contaminants into them. Okay, so now we're on to the alveoli. This tube here is a terminal bronchiole, and it ends in these clusters of alveoli, which are tiny air sacs. Now, what's really important about the alveoli is that they're only one cell thick, which means that there's a very thin layer between them and the blood vessels surrounding them. And the reason why this is significant is because it increases the rate of diffusion. So it means that oxygen can very quickly get into that blood network, and carbon dioxide can very quickly leave the blood network and go back into the alveoli and back the way the air came. You can see that these alveoli, these air sacs, are round in shape, and this is also significant because it presents a larger surface area to volume ratio for gas exchange to happen. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the lungs themselves. And we can see here on this diagram that the right lung is slightly bigger than the left lung. And this is because the heart sits slightly to the left, and this occupies space, therefore the left lung has to be slightly smaller. Okay, now the lungs are quite large structures and they take up most of the thoracic or chest cavity. So it's the lungs are actually divided into lobes. On the right hand side we've got 3 lobes, and on the left we have 2. And as they are constantly moving, they're constantly expanding and contracting. We have 2 layers of membrane. We have the parietal pleura on the outside and the visceral pleura on the inside. And you can see in this little animation here, it's demonstrating the parietal pleura, which is the outside, and the visceral on the inside. Now, between these 2 membranes, the one that covers the outside and the inside of the lungs, we have pleural fluid. Now, this fluid does an important role. It allows the lungs to remain stuck, as it were, but they're not really stuck. It allows it to adhere to the inside lining of the chest wall, and crucially it reduces friction. So the lungs are constantly contracting and expanding, and you don't want any friction build up when you're breathing, because that would start to cause pain. So this fluid helps to significantly reduce that friction. Okay, so here's a summary of what we have learned so far in this lesson. Air will enter the nasal cavity via the nose and the mouth, where it becomes humidified and filtered. Air will pass down the pharynx, epiglottis, larynx, and then onto the trachea. And the trachea itself is held open by rings of C-shaped cartilage. It's also lined with epithelial tissue that produces mucus and has cilia to trap that dirt, dust and bacteria and sweep it away from the lungs. The trachea will split into primary bronchi that go to each lung, and they are like branches of a tree. So the branches get smaller and smaller, so you have primary, secondary and tertiary branches of the bronchi. And as we get to the smaller branches, there are less cartilage surrounding those tubes, and we have more elastin tissue and smooth muscle. All of these structures also have epithelial tissue with mucus, and they will also contain cilia to line those structures. The bronchioles will end up forming terminal bronchi at the end of each alveoli. So these branches are the smallest, and they are made only of smooth muscle and elastin, and this is to regulate airflow. Sorry, I said terminal, I meant tertiary bronchi. So there are two lungs, and the left has 2 lobes, the right has 3 lobes. The reason for the difference is because the left has the heart occupying some of that space, and the lungs are really large organs, and they occupy all of that chest cavity except for where the heart and the blood vessels are. Okay, so final thing is the lungs are lined on the outer surface by the parietal pleura, by that membrane, and on the inside surface by the visceral pleural membrane. These layers will help to decrease friction by having that layer of pleural fluid in between, and it will also allow the lungs to adhere to the chest wall. Okay, so that is your lesson for today. Please make sure that you have or will read pages 86 to 88 of your textbook. Work through questions on pages 4 to 9 of your booklet. This is due on Thursday the 17th of March. And please make sure that you write in your booklet. All of your exams and tests are handwritten, so you need to get into the habit of doing this now. Thanks.